Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you tonight on this cold Wednesday night. We were trying to decide who we were going up against. We know it's Virginia Tech, but we don't know who the other team is tonight. But anyway, we're so glad that you're here this evening, kind of restarting our series on Wednesday night with people, God, in the state, and we're getting ready to do 4 weeks as we make our way through church history. And I'm just so excited. As a history major, I'm really excited about this, honestly, Glenn. So I'm really excited you will be with us tonight and lead us in these next 4 weeks. But we're so delighted to have Dr. Glenn Jonas with us. He is the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Campbell University. He was the chair of the religion department for many years before that. And we know he's a great church historian. He's heard so many wonderful things. People have had him for class. So we're looking forward to Glenn leading us here in just a few moments. He shared with me that he remembers being here in the 90s when he first came to Campbell. Dr. Purr had him come lead a deacon banquet one time. So some of you are old enough, Ray, you're old enough to remember that. So anyway, so we're looking forward to our time together tonight. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll begin. Lord, thank you for this time together, for us to consider this wonderful topic, to stretch our minds and to think about what it means to be your people at this time and what it meant to be your people throughout history, especially in regarding how we relate to our state and how we make a difference in the world around us. And so just be with us tonight as we listen and as we engage together. We thank you for Dr. Jonas being with us tonight. We offer this prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Go ahead and come on up.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and it's good to be with you all tonight. And as I understand it, I'm going to be with you for the next 3 hours tonight. So we'll take some breaks. Oh, it's the next 3 Wednesday nights after this. So anyway, I'm so glad to be back at Trinity. Like Jeff said, I remember being here. I think it was in this actual room at a deacon's banquet years ago, and Dr. Furr asked me to come and do something on deacon ministry. I can't even remember what I talked about, but I did that, and then I've run in your 5K. Well, if you want to call it running, I tend to sort of slog more than run, but in your 5K it has always been in September when it's just blazing hot. And so I've run in your 5K several times, and so I'm glad to be here at Trinity, and I appreciate the invitation, Jeff, to be with you. As I understand it, my assignment is to talk with you about church and state through several different periods in Christian history. And tonight we're going to be dealing in the area where I probably have the least amount of expertise. I am not really a Middle Ages person. It is a fascinating period of time, but I do talk about what I'm going to talk about tonight with you. I do talk about it in class, so I'll give you a little bit of what I know about it. But I appreciate the opportunity. Next week, we'll be talking about church and state in the Reformation era, the 16th century. And then we're going to talk about church and state in early America. I'm looking forward to that. And then finally, we're going to talk about church and state in kind of the Baptist story. And so that's kind of where we're going over the next month. And so I'll be looking forward to these times. And so tonight, let's talk about church and state in Christendom. And so let me make sure this thing changes. There we go. Now, so what is Christendom? What is Christendom? Why is it ought to change when I click. There we go. Yeah. So here's a definition of Christendom that I sort of pulled out of one of the books that I like a lot. Mark Knoll wrote a really interesting book. It's actually in its 3rd edition now, I believe, called Turning Points Turning Points, Decisive Moments in the History of Christianity. And he goes through Christian history, and he sort of pulls out what he believes to be the turning points, the events that are, in his opinion, the most important events in Christian history. Actually had my church history class read that book last fall, and their paper for the semester, I had them write their top 10 turning points in Christian history. And I told them they could only use 3 of his, and they had to come up with 7 of their own. And so it was kind of interesting reading those papers and seeing what they came up with. But I think we all would maybe have our own list of the turning points in Christian history, but he makes a pretty good case in his book. And he has I think, a pretty good definition of Christendom. And I'll just read it to you. It's up here on the screen. An integrated view of life in which everything, politics, social order, religious practice, economic relationships, and more, was based on the Christian faith as communicated by the Roman Catholic Church and protected by the actions of secular rulers. So essentially, what we're talking about here is that Christendom is the term we use to describe the social order of the Middle Ages, covering roughly the period from the 9th until the 16th centuries. It begins to break down in the 16th century with the dawn of the Reformation. And then by the time you get into the 17th century, Christendom is breaking down even further. Now, a little side statement here. For the purposes of this study tonight, I'm going to be talking almost exclusively about Western Europe and about Western Christianity. There is a whole other world of Christianity over in the eastern part of what was at that time the old Roman Empire. And so by the time you get to the 9th century, you can start talking about Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. Eastern Christianity we refer to as Roman Catholicism in the Middle Ages. It's very Latin in culture. Latin is sort of the dominant language that comes along. Over in the East, it's a very Greek culture, and Greek is the language that dominates the Eastern Church. And it would take probably a couple more sessions to deal with Eastern Christianity, but for our purposes, we're just going to deal with Western Christianity and talk about Christendom in the West. So essentially then, Christendom is the term that we use to describe the social order of the Middle Ages, covering roughly this period of time from the 9th to the 16th century. So what was church and state like during this period of time? Well, but before I get to that, for a historian, it's really hard just to jump into something without talking about some of the things that happened before that. I sort of believe that everything that happens in history happens as a result of things that happened before that. And so you can just think about any major thing that's happening, even in our world today. Let's look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. There are antecedents to that. There are things that have been happening over the last several decades that have sort of brought the events to fruition today with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and so forth. And so for our purposes tonight, I'd like for us to back up a few centuries, and I want us to think about 2 things for just a couple minutes. One, I want us to talk for just a second about Constantine as emperor of the Roman Empire. And then in addition to that, I want us to think about what we call the Barbarian Invasions into Western Europe. So let's talk now first about Constantine. There's a statue of Constantine. Some of you know this story. I'm going to bring my clicker next to you. You know the story of Constantine's conversion to Christianity. I don't know how we would ever know whether somebody is genuinely converted to Christianity or not. Historians debate about how committed he truly was to Christianity. On the one hand, he did affiliate himself with the Christian faith, and he identified with churches. He gave lots of money and lots of attention and lots of favors to Christianity. On the other hand, up until his death, he continued to preside in the pagan rituals, in the expectations that the Roman world of his day had with what they expected from the emperor. And so he was Christian, but he also continued to sort of serve in his role as the leader of the pagan religions and so forth. But you all know the story. It's told in Eusebius of Caesarea's Life of Constantine, how Constantine on the eve of the battle to win control over the western portion of the old Roman Empire had the vision or the dream, however you interpret that, where he saw a cross emblazoned in the sky, and he was told, under this sign, go forth and conquer. And he supposedly had his soldiers paint crosses on the shields, and he went into battle, and he won the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. And that gave him sole possession of the western portion of the Roman Empire. One of Constantine's predecessors, an emperor named Diocletian, had divided the empire into an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. He thought that in doing that, if you have an Eastern Emperor and a Western Emperor, and a vice emperor would be maybe what we would call it under each one of them, it would get rid of all the civil wars that they were having when the emperor would die, because there would be a smooth path of succession. So that's what Diocletian did, but the end result was that it made things even worse. And so you end up with 4 people competing with one another for control and so forth. And Constantine was caught up in that. And so in 312, he finally wins control of the western portion of the empire. But his goal, Constantine's goal, was to preside over a united Roman Empire once again. He wanted to reunite Eastern and Western, the Eastern portion and the Western portion of the empire. And so 10 years later, that happens. He wins a battle 10 years later with his counterpart in the East, and he becomes the emperor of a united Roman Empire once again. And of course, when you unite the empire, that is going to take a lot of work. And so he looked to Christianity as the glue that would kind of hold his empire together. And that's how he saw. He saw a lot of Christians in the East, a lot of Christians in the West. Christianity is a growing, thriving religion by this time, and a lot of folks are converting to Christianity. And so Constantine thinks that he can use Christianity as a glue to sort of hold his empire together. So his overall goal was to preside over a united empire. And he pretty much does that for the rest of his life. So what were the results of Constantine? His impact. Well, persecution against Christians ceased. You may have heard in a history class, Western Civ class or something, about the famous Edict of Milan. That was a decree that was issued by Constantine in the West and his counterpart in the East in the year 313. The Edict of Milan made Christianity a legal religion within the Roman Empire. Now, it did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire. That's going to be several decades later. But it did give Christianity legal status. And so what that means is that no one could persecute Christians anymore. Most of the persecutions that Christians went through in the first 3 centuries of Christianity were not the empire-wide emperor, decreeing that all Christians need to be arrested. We sometimes think of that. Most of the persecutions that Christians endured tended to be localized. it tended to be local rulers that would have it in for the Christians in their areas, and they would implement some kind of local law against the Christians. A lot of the persecution was social ostracism, but after the Edict of Milan, it was you could no longer persecute Christians. So that immediately gives Christianity a legal status in the empire. Additionally, there was this is a term that Justo Gonzalez uses in his little 2-volume Story of Christianity textbooks. He says there's this thing called an official theology that develops, and what he means by that is that Christians came to view Constantine as being divinely appointed by God. Eusebius of Caesarea is probably the best example of that. He was a theologian, bishop of Caesarea in the early 4th century. He wrote the first history of Christianity, simply called Church History. And he also wrote the life of Constantine. And he was a huge fan of Constantine. He thought Constantine was the best thing since sliced bread. Well, they didn't have sliced bread back then, but he was the best thing to come along, almost messianic. And how could he not think that? How could Christians not think that? After all, how many times do you think during periods of persecution, and during the worst persecution of all, which was during Constantine's predecessor, Diocletian, which was an empire-wide persecution, it's called the Great Persecution for a reason. How many times do you think Christians gathered and prayed for God to bring an end to the persecution? And suddenly it ends with the action of Constantine. How could you not think that Constantine was almost messianic? And so there develops within the consciousness of Christians that this secular ruler is sent by God to make our lives better. And so I want you to keep that thought in mind as we go through this study, not only tonight, but over the next several weeks. Another thing that Constantine does, and I haven't got time to go into all this tonight, but you've heard of the Council of Nicaea, the Nicene Creed, a huge, right after Constantine wins control of the western portion of the empire, and right after he wins control of the entire empire, reunites it, suddenly a huge controversy breaks out among the bishops of all things about theology and about the second member of the Godhead, Christ, the Son. And they start arguing, and finally Constantine says, look, I'm just going to bring them all together in a big meeting over here in Nicaea. It's close to Constantinople, where he moved the capital to. In fact, it was a vacation resort. He said, I'm going to bring all these bishops together and just let them talk it out. We call that the Council of Nicaea. Here's the interesting thing about that, though. Constantine, as emperor, presided over the Council of Nicaea. So you've got a secular emperor presiding over a council that's designed to settle church doctrine. And Constantine ultimately makes the decision of how to rule in that. That's an important point to think about. So on the one hand, within the consciousness of Western Christianity, you've already got Christians that are thinking that Constantine is almost messianic, God's appointed person for this hour, and Constantine is assuming roles over church councils. And by the way, the same kind of things going on will ultimately go on in the East as well. Okay, so persecution ceased, this official theology developed. There are a few other little things here. I'm really not this technologically challenged. There was an influx of aristocratic wealth and power. The church became very wealthy during Constantine's time. And the simplicity of the faith, the humility of the faith, the emperor is now a Christian. The emperor is giving all kinds of money to churches to build big church buildings and so forth. So a lot of wealth of power comes into the church. But then that ultimately leads to some changes in worship. After all, if the emperor is coming to church, the emperor is going to bring his entourage with him, and there are protocols for how we deal with the emperor. And so the simplicity of worship services began to change, and worship began to take on much more of a pomp and circumstance kind of atmosphere. So keep that in mind as well. And then one last thing that Constantine did. He moved the capital of the empire from Rome to the ancient city of Byzantium. He renamed it Constantinople after himself, which will give you a little bit of idea about how he thought of himself, right? And so he renames it Constantinople. The story goes that he walked with his advisors about a mile outside of Byzantium and down the road, and he took a big stick and he stuck it in the ground, and he said, when I'm finished, this will be where the city begins. And so he, of course, we know that as the city of Istanbul today in Turkey. But so those are some of the things that Constantine did with Christianity. And so we've got Christianity already kind of the seeds of what we're getting at in the Middle Ages, I think, are sown during the time of Constantine. And then tragedy comes. The Barbarian Invasions. Again, if you've had a Western Civ class, this is nothing that is new to you. These Germanic tribes from what would be today Germany and France, northern France, even up above Germany, they begin to make their way down into the northern regions of the Roman Empire, into the west. They don't really go into the east very much. What we call the Barbarian Invasions is pretty much a Western thing. And these Germanic tribes begin to move west and south. A lot of different names they went by: the Goths, the Visigoths, which were the Western Goths, the Ostrogoths, which were the Eastern Goths, the Franks. Some of these names might, we've taken some of these names of these tribes into the English language. If you think of something that's Gothic, well, you got Gothic architecture in the Middle Ages, but nowadays the word Gothic sort of implies dark and dreary and scary and so forth. And I think it comes from that period of time when it was a time of great social unrest, and it was a complicated time. And then the Burgundians, the Franks, we'll talk about the Franks in a minute, the Lombards. There's a group called the Vandals. The word vandalism, we get that from this period of time as well. It was finally just tell me to quit hitting the right click button. It was finally the Ostrogoths who came in and overthrew the city of Rome in 476 AD. And that's the famous fall of Rome. And so, just try to imagine what this was like. The entire western portion of the Roman Empire, all of the organization of the empire, all of the organization of the state government, everything just went into chaos. And so you have these Germanic tribes that are taking over certain areas, these chieftains that are warring against one another, and it was a time of great, I would call it darkness. It was a time of great social dislocation, refugees going from one place to the other. And so the western portion of the empire, by the time you get to the 6th, 7th centuries, is just almost in complete disorganization, dislocation. It's kind of interesting. Some of these tribes were nominally Christian. If you go back for a second to the Council of Nicaea, the group that lost, at the Council of Nicaea, a group of people called the Arians, Arians. Don't confuse them with the white supremacist Arians is spelled a whole different way. But the so-called Arian Christianity, once these bishops and Christians are declared to be heretics, they kind of leave the empire, and a lot of them became missionaries and began to carry Arian Christianity up there among some of these Gothic tribes. One of the most famous of these Arian missionaries was a guy named Ulfilas, and he spread Christianity. He devised the written language of the Goths. He lived among the Goths and he learned their language, and then he developed an alphabet, and he preached to them in the Gothic language, and he even translated some of the scriptures into Gothic for them. And so some of these groups were, as I said, they were very much familiar, at least, with Christianity. They were not totally pagan. Okay, so all that's in the background, and that leads us up to the time of Charlemagne. So let's talk now for just a minute about Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. It's kind of the next step, and it's with Charlemagne that we finally get what I would call Christendom as we understand it in Western Europe. Charlemagne was born in 742. He was the son of Pepin the Short. I love that name. I don't know if I'd want to go through life being called Glenn the Short. Pepin the Short. He was the king of the Franks, and so evidently you didn't make fun of him too much, or he would take care of him. But Pepin the Short, and Pepin died in the year 768, and so when Pepin died, his kingdom, the Frank kingdom, which was located in the area that would be modern day France today, right? That's where France, the word France comes from. The kingdom was split between Charlemagne and his son his brother Carloman. And just 3 years later, Carloman died. As far as I know, they got along with each other. It's just Carloman died in 771, and that left Charlemagne the sole ruler of the Frank kingdom. And Charlemagne was a brilliant leader, a brilliant ruler. His goal, like Constantine, there are some parallels between the two of them. His goal, like Constantine, was to find some kind of way to unify Europe once again, or what they knew as Europe. And he ends up doing that. He was a warrior. He was very effective as an administrator, and he set about to try and gain territory, take over other groups, and to expand his territory and so forth. By the way, this painting comes from the 16th century German painter named Dürer. And if you'll notice, it's quite common with Charlemagne in art to present him with the sword in one hand and the orb of the earth with the cross in the other hand. Those are the symbols of church and state. So don't miss the symbolism of this painting. It is Charlemagne holding both church and state, sort of like Constantine did. And that's what Christendom is. It is church and state combined together. And so Charlemagne becomes the ultimate ruler. A lot of things happen politically over the next couple decades. Charlemagne becomes a protector to the Pope down in Rome, and there's also at this time a lot of nostalgia for the old Roman Empire. They would love for Rome to be restored to its time of glory back in the days of the old Roman Empire. A lot of things are circulating around, and that ultimately leads to this event that happens. And that's the painting. That's another famous painting. That painting is actually in the Vatican. But this is the coronation of Charlemagne as the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne is kneeling in prayer in Rome at what wasn't anything like St. Peter's Cathedral today. That was built in the 16th century. But what was St. Peter's back then? He was kneeling in prayer Christmas Day in the year 800. And the Pope comes and crowns him as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And the words that supposedly were said to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans, long life and victory. So Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne as the emperor, and this signaled the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, and it caused the emergence of what we call Christian Europe, or the term that I used in the beginning, Christendom, because you have church and state united together. Well, Charlemagne was, as I said, a very effective ruler. He promoted education. He wanted to find a standardized language for Western Europe, which he worked really hard to make Latin kind of the standardized language. Eventually, the different dialects that come out of what we know as the Romance languages today kind of come from that. But Charlemagne was really effective at bringing a unity to Western Europe. And so from 800 on, you will have an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And that's going to be very important throughout Christian history from 800 on in the West, because there will be times where the emperor and the Pope in Rome are in lockstep with each other. And then there are going to be times where they're going to be at odds with each other. And then there are going to be times where they're going to be parallel with each other, working together. And so the dynamics between church and state over the next 7, 8 centuries or so is going to really be important, particularly in Christianity. For example, in the 11th century, there's that famous conflict between Gregory VII and Henry IV. Henry IV was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by that time. This is the year 1076, something like that, 1083, somewhere up in the late 11th century. And Henry IV was, as emperor, thought that he had the authority to appoint bishops. That was something that the emperors started doing about a century earlier, because the clergy within the church in Western Europe had become so corrupt. And so the emperors took over that practice. It was called lay investiture. And they began appointing bishops. Well, it eventually came to the place where the emperors would appoint someone as a bishop as a political favor. So it would give certain noblemen a certain amount of power to be the bishop of Raleigh or the bishop of Bowie's Creek or something like that. So far, I don't think we've got a bishop in Bowie's Creek yet. And so the office of bishop became a political prize. Well, Gregory VII came along as Pope, and he said, you can't do that. The emperor doesn't have the authority to do that. And they clashed with each other in a famous clash in Canossa, Italy, where the Pope excommunicated the emperor and made him come all the way across the Alps to Canossa and asked to be restored to the church. And the Pope made him wait in the snow for 3 days, wearing sackcloth and ashes, before he finally brought him up to the castle and warmed him up and heard his confession. So there are times where the emperor and the popes clashed with each other. But that's what's going on with Christendom during this time. But basically speaking, you have church and state tied together. And so we're accustomed today of thinking about the institution of the church and the institution of the state being separate from one another, because that's encoded in our Constitution. That is encoded in the First Amendment. The phrase isn't there, but the idea is there. Congress shall make no law providing for an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, the government is not going to be in the church business, and the church is not going to run the government. That's kind of the way the founders intended our country to be. We'll talk about that down the line. In Western Europe, there was nothing like that. And the first groups to start talking about separating those two institutions comes next week when we talk about the Reformation. That's when this all starts to break down. Okay, now I've given you kind of the background there from Constantine to the Barbarian Invasions, to the breakdown of order in society, to Charlemagne reestablishing some order, being crowned by the Pope as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So, what does all this mean? Well, there's a term that gets used a lot, the term theocracy. I don't know if you've ever heard that term or even used that term or not. Literally, it means God rules. God rules the people. On paper, theocracy sounds pretty good. As Christian people, we believe God is the ruler of our lives, right? We surrender ourselves to God and we follow God. It gets a little bit more complicated when you start talking about theocracy as a system of government. I'll talk next week a little bit about Geneva under John Calvin. And then the week after that, we'll talk a little bit about Massachusetts Bay under the Puritans and what life was like when you have something that resembles a theocracy. The problem with theocracies, the problem with a theocracy is that in a theocracy, ultimately, either a human being or a group of human beings has to make, quote, God's decision for everybody else, right? And that's where you can't have theocracy and democracy at the same time. It just, those two are mutually exclusive. And so theocracies generally break down because humans are sinful. And what you might think is the will of God for me and my family, I might not think that's the will of God for me and my family. So what gives you the right to tell me and my family what we should or shouldn't do? That's what happens. It interferes with conscience. Church and state as two institutions are fused together as one. That's Christendom. So let me throw some things out to you. I want to hear you talk now for a few minutes. And this first question, what is the motivation for joining together the church and the state? Just from the basis of what we've talked about tonight, what is the motivation? Why would church and state need to come together? Any thoughts?
Organization.
Good. Organization. Somebody, is that what you would? Yeah, unify the people to bring order out of chaos, right? I mean, you can't blame Eusebius of Caesarea for looking to Constantine as being the one that answered God's prayers, or being the answer to our prayers to God to end this persecution. I forget where I heard it. I heard some church historians on video or something talking about this. When those bishops came to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to discuss the Arian issue about the second member of the Trinity and whether the Son was created or whether the Son existed co-eternally with the Father. Sounds like such a ridiculous thing, but it was an important theological idea. When they came together to discuss that, there were about 300 of them. Constantine invites them to Nicaea. It's a vacation resort. He paid their way. And a lot of these bishops were old men that literally had scars on their bodies from the great persecution when they had been arrested and tortured. And here the emperor is inviting them to a vacation resort to discuss theology. How could you not think this is God's will? How, Constantine brings some order out of the chaos. Charlemagne does the same thing. Western Europe had broken down. And so uniting church and state together is a very tempting thing because it's not messy. It's organized. It's neat. Everything's taken care of. Separating the two and allowing religious freedom is messy. When you allow complete religious freedom, that means that anybody that feels the call of God on their life can go start a church, right? And so you end up with the 45-year-old person that goes downtown and starts to rent the old furniture building when the furniture store went out of business, which furniture stores are always going out of business, at least if you believe their advertisements. But he rents the furniture store building, and he starts the apostolic, holy, burning bush, fire-breathing Church of God, right? And next thing you know, it's 6 months later, and there's 100 people down there worshiping. And there's not a thing in the world that can stop that unless they're hurting people or unless they're violating some kind of code or something. But when you have church and state tied together, it's easier. It's not messy. You don't get folks with wild theological ideas out there. So it does bring order out of chaos. What are some other temptations to uniting the two institutions together? What are some other reasons why that would be attractive?
I bet it from the emperor's standpoint, it's bringing a growing movement to heal.
Yeah.
Making it easier to govern if putting everybody under one banner.
Exactly. Yeah. Did y'all hear Andrew? He said that from the emperor's perspective, it's much easier because you're putting everybody under the same banner. You're bringing everybody to heal under one tradition, and it's much easier to govern that way. It is good. Back here.
Control.
Do what now? Control, exactly. Yeah, I mean, we can go ahead and say that out loud. It allows the emperor to have control. Now, I've known your pastor a good while now. You've got a good pastor, and I'm about 99.99% sure that your pastor encourages you to think for yourselves, and he doesn't. He's not going to have a meeting after we finish tonight and with all the Sunday school teachers and tell you all what you're supposed to teach your Sunday school class Sunday. I have known Baptist churches, by the way, that do that. My wife was a member of one long before I met her, but the pastor every Wednesday night had a meeting with the Sunday school teachers, and he told them what they were supposed to teach in Sunday school. It wasn't just a teacher's meeting. He was literally telling them, you must teach this and you must teach that. He had a whole code of conduct. He scolded the women for wearing pants. My wife came by the church one day with a pair of jeans on, and he scolded her for wearing pants. Women don't wear pants, he said. So there's some, even in the Baptist world, there are pastors that are that restrictive. It's easier to be a pastor if everybody's following along, if you're the commander and everybody's following along with what you tell them to do. I'm not so sure it's good for the church. I'm not so sure it's good for the people, but it's easier. So yeah, control is we can say that out loud. It's much easier to control when you've got the church and the state tied together.
Well, from the church's perspective, it's their protection and control too, right? They had that influence. They were powerful.
Exactly. Yeah, it gives the leadership of the church. It gives the Pope. The Pope draws power from the emperor. The emperor draws power from the Pope. They're mutually beneficial when they're tied together. Yeah, good. What are the detriments to church and state as institutions being tied together? Pretty obvious, I think. What are some of the pitfalls? Jesus was never about earthly power. Very good. Yeah. I don't know why it's so hard for people to see that sometimes. But Jesus was never about earthly power. He challenged the earthly powers, right? That's what ultimately led him to the cross. Okay, good. Jesus was never about earthly power. What else?
Lack of freedom.
Lack of freedom. Good. Yeah. If you're expecting everybody to sort of be in lockstep together, nobody has the freedom to express their faith or to follow God in the way that they feel the Spirit leading them to follow. So there is no freedom there. Good.
Takes away from personal decisions.
Good. It takes we've got a concept in the Baptist world, in Baptist life called the liberty of conscience. The idea there is that I've heard Buddy Sheridan say this, that in the Baptist like tradition, there are other traditions that are like us, but it's the individual at the end of their life stands before God, and there's conscience is important, but you can't have conscience. You can't allow freedom of conscience if you've got church and state tied together. So these are some of the things that. Well, go ahead. You get another.
Temptation towards nationalism.
Oh, yeah, good. The temptation toward nationalism. That's that phrase, Christian nationalism, is a term that we're seeing some in the press now. When we get to the end of this, I would like for us to have a little bit of a conversation about that. And maybe it may pop up a little more in the intervening sessions. But this whole thing about patriotism is a good thing. I'm patriotic. I mean, you don't have to travel to another part of the world and experience life in another part of the world for very long before you land back in the United States, and you're so glad to be back home in our country, and makes you appreciate what we have and so forth. Patriotism is a good thing, but Christian nationalism is, I think, a perversion of patriotism, and it can be a destructive thing. And we'll talk about the differences later, and also something called civil religion, which also can be a good thing. Civil religion holds us together as a people, but when civil religion becomes our faith, it can become destructive. And so we'll flesh some of that out later on. But good.
I got one more thing.
Go ahead, sure.
My perspective of Christianity is it's very voluntary.
It's very what?
Very voluntary.
Good, yeah.
People are Christians because they want to be Christians.
That's good.
They want to follow Jesus. Governments today, a lot of them have a characteristic where they're using force against the people. Our government, in my opinion, role for our government is to protect the rights of the people. But many characteristics where it's using force against the people. Many governments across the world are using force against the people. So in that perspective, I see Christianity very, very much opposed to governments who are willing to use force against the people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Christianity is a voluntary religion. You make a decision to follow Jesus voluntarily. And now, I go back into this period of time in the Middle Ages. There are stories of some of these missionaries that were going out among the barbarian groups that were convincing the chiefs of some of these tribes to convert to Christianity, which they would do. And then the chiefs would order their armies to convert to Christianity. There's one great story of one of these guys, his name's Clovis, and he had a conversion experience, sort of like Constantine's, and he promised God that if he won a battle, he would convert to Christianity. He won his battle, so he converted to Christianity. He then said, I want my army to be Christian as well. So he marched them through the river, and the priests were standing on both sides of the army with tree branches. And they would dip the branches in the water of the river and sprinkle the water over the army and baptize them as they were marching through the river. That's not voluntary Christianity. That's doing what my orders are, sir. And so I think you're right onto something, that when Christianity is not voluntary, I don't think it's Christianity. That's a pretty strong statement, I know, but you can't, you can't force conscience. And we'll talk about a group next week called the Anabaptists that learned that. So, in other words,
What would you call it if you don't call it Christianity? It's not voluntary. What would you call it?
you'd have to have the title Christianity. I would say that I don't think that it's the Jesus style of Christianity. It's not the way I read Jesus. Jesus never forced anyone into following him. And but now we call those soldiers that march through that river Christian, right? Because what else are you going to call them? They're not Buddhists, and they're not Hindus, and so we put them in that banner of Christianity. But I think the genuineness of the faith requires that it be a voluntary commitment to Christ rather than a forced commitment to Christ. And so that's what I mean by it not being true Christianity. It's kind of my interpretation of Jesus. And so that's why I said it's kind of a strong statement. But yeah, good question. You guys think, that's good. You think more than my students do. My students will be like, Dr. Jones, when is this going to be over with? I need to get out of here and get some coffee or something. So, I've got 7:26. Is that about time to dismiss? And so I will look forward to being with you. Next week, we're going to talk about the Reformation. And I especially want to talk about John Calvin and then a group of people called the Anabaptists. That I'm sure you've heard both of those names before, but they both had kind of different ideas about this stuff that we're talking about tonight. All right, Jeff?
Dr. Jonas for leading us tonight. We look forward to next week, Reformation. Let's pray together and we'll dismiss. Lord, thank you for the history that we have and how your Holy Spirit has worked through all the changes throughout world history. Always continue to call people to you, to salvation, and to serve you and to be your church. And we're grateful that somewhere along the way, someone shared the good news with us and we chose to follow you. And so tonight we go from this place rejoicing that we belong to you and we're a part of your people. And we pray that you be with us as we go into our homes, give us rest this evening as we continue this week. And we offer this prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Everybody have a great night. That's good. Yeah.